October 14th, 1874. The Dakota Territory did not welcome strangers. It tolerated them only until the first snow, at which point it usually tried to kill them. The wind on the high plains did not blow around obstacles. It scoured them, seeking out every crack, every loose nail, and every weakness in the spirit of those foolish enough to stake a claim on the flat, treeless expanse. Lynn stood on her plot of land, a small, solitary figure against a horizon that felt dangerously infinite. She was not looking up at the graying sky, nor was she measuring the height of the non-existent timber she would need to build a shanty. She was looking down. While the other homesteaders were scrambling to secure overpriced green lumber from the railhead 30 miles east, Lynn was swinging a pickaxe into the semi-frozen sod. The rhythm was monotonous and heavy. Thud, drag, lift. Thud, drag, lift. She had been at it for 3 days, cutting a rectangular scar into the earth, 12 feet by 14. To the casual observer, it looked less like a home and more like a mass grave. The soil here was dense clay hidden beneath a tangled mat of buffalo grass roots, tough as iron wire. Most settlers cursed the dirt. They fought it, trying to scrape it away to lay wooden floorboards that would warp within a month. Lynn treated the earth as an ally. She understood a principle that the men hammering flimsy frames nearby had ignored. On the open plains, the surface is a killing zone. The safety lay beneath. She wasn't building up, exposing surface area to the wind's teeth. She was digging down. Her hands, wrapped in strips of boiled wool, moved with a terrifying economy. There was no wasted energy in her swing. She was a widow, her husband lost to a rail accident the year prior, and she possessed the specific, dangerous focus of someone who has realized that grief is a luxury she cannot afford. Survival was a math equation, and Lynn was solving for X. She had marked out a specific section on the north wall of her excavation, a deep recess carved 3 feet further back into the bank than the living space. This wasn't for a bed, and it wasn't for a shrine. It was for wood. While others stacked their fuel in towering, teetering piles against the exterior of their cabins, exposing it to the sleet and the rot, Lynn was preparing to bring the forest underground. She knew that wet wood hissed and sputtered, wasting half its energy boiling off its own water content before it could heat a room. She needed heat, not steam. The local community, a loose collection of hopefuls and desperados, watched her progress with a mixture of confusion and derision. They were men of timber and nail, convinced that civilization meant a structure that cast a shadow. Thomas, a man with a loud laugh and a drafty jaw, rode by on a roan mare, pausing to watch Lynn hoist a basket of clay from the pit. He turned to his companion, Jeb, a scarecrow of a man who prided himself on doing things the way his grandfather had in Kentucky. They looked at the woman, waist deep in the ground, her braid coiled tight against her head, her boots caked in the dark, heavy soil. To them, she looked like an animal, burrowing for hibernation, a regression from the civilized ideals of the Homestead Act. They did not see the engineering. They saw only the dirt. "Reckon she's digging straight through to China, Jeb?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying easily over the flat ground. "Or maybe she plans to bury the whole wagon." Jeb spat a stream of tobacco juice that froze slightly before it hit the dust. "Let her dig," Jeb replied, shaking his head with the weary superiority of a man who believes he knows the world. "Dirt is for the dead, Thomas. No decent Christian lives in a hole. Damp will get in her lungs. She'll be coughing up blood by February, assuming the roof don't collapse on her first." He raised his voice, shouting down into the pit. "Hey, you need a hand digging that grave, missus? Are you planning to pull the dirt in on top of yourself?" Lynn stopped. She rested the handle of the pickaxe against her shoulder and looked up. Her face was unreadable, her eyes dark and flat. She did not smile, and she did not look angry. She looked at Jeb with the clinical detachment of a doctor observing a patient with a terminal, self-inflicted condition. "The wind takes the woodhouse," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a strange, stony resonance. "The earth keeps the heat. My wood stays dry. Yours will be ice." Jeb laughed, a harsh, barking sound that was swallowed instantly by the prairie wind. "My wood is stacked 5 feet high, woman. Seasoned oak and pine. I got walls. I got a roof. You got a hole." He spurred his horse, and the two men rode off, convinced that the silent woman in the mud was simply mad with grief. They did not know that Lynn had already calculated the R value of their uninsulated pine planks and found them wanting. The skepticism of the town was not merely social. It was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of thermodynamics, a subject Lynn knew intuitively, even if she did not use the academic terms. The technical reality of the high plains is a brutal arithmetic. When the ambient air temperature drops to 40 degrees below zero, a standard timber wall, even one chinked with mud and moss, offers negligible thermal resistance. The wind chill strips heat away from a vertical surface at a rate that defies conventional heating methods. A cast iron stove in a drafty cabin becomes a ravenous beast, demanding fuel every hour just to keep water from freezing in the kettle. Lynn, however, was leveraging the thermal mass of the planet itself. Below the frost line, which in this latitude sat roughly 3 to 4 feet down, the Earth maintained a consistent temperature of about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the blizzard raging above. By sinking her floor 4 feet deep, Lynn was not trying to heat her home from 0 to 60. She was heating it from 50 to 60. It was an efficiency gain of massive proportions. But the true genius lay in the ventilation and the fuel storage. She constructed a flue, not of expensive iron, but of hollowed clay tiles. She fired herself in a small kiln she'd built the first week. This chimney ran along the floor before rising, a system known in her homeland as a Kang variation, allowing the smoke to heat the thermal mass of the earth floor before exiting. Furthermore, the wood recess she had carved was positioned strategically. By storing her fuel inside the thermal envelope of the dugout, but separated by a brick partition, the wood was constantly subjected to the radiant heat of the room and the ambient dryness of the subterranean air, which she controlled with a primitive but effective passive ventilation shaft. While Jeb's woodpile would soon be encased in ice, absorbing moisture from the snowdrifts, Lynn's wood was effectively being kiln-dried day and night. The physics were undeniable. Dry wood burns hotter, cleaner, and longer. A log with 20% moisture content yields nearly twice the usable heat of a log with 40% moisture. Lynn wasn't just digging a home. She was building a machine to survive the winter, calibrated to the specific variables of the Dakota ecosystem. The first test of her design arrived in early November, a sharp, biting precursor to the true winter. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in the span of an hour. The ground, previously soft enough to dig, snapped shut, freezing into a solid pavement of soil. In the town, the sounds of panic began to drift on the wind. The frantic chopping of wood, the banging of shutters, the shouting of men trying to seal gaps in their walls with rags and tallow. The cold was not a passive absence of heat. It was an active, invading force. It sought entry under door jambs and through keyholes. Inside the dugout, the atmosphere was radically different. Lynn descended the 4 earthen steps, closing the heavy, insulated hatch she had constructed from layers of canvas and straw packed between wooden planks. The silence was immediate. The howling wind which tore at the eaves of the frame houses above was reduced to a dull, distant vibration in the soil. She struck a match. The flame flared bright yellow, steady and upright. There was no draft to make it flicker. She walked to her fuel niche. The wood there, cut from river willow and scavenged oak, was bone dry. It clattered with a sharp, hollow sound as she stacked it. She fed the firebox. The kindling caught instantly, and the draft, pulled by the perfectly calculated height of her external chimney, drew the smoke away in a smooth, laminar flow. Within 20 minutes, the small space was warm. Not just bearable, but warm. She placed a kettle on the flat stone above the firebox. In the cabins of her neighbors, men were currently wearing their coats indoors, huddled close to stoves that roasted their fronts while their backs froze. Lynn removed her heavy wool outer coat. She sat on the edge of the raised earthen platform, listening to the muffled roar of the wind above her head, feeling the heat radiate up from the floor itself. She was a captain in a submarine, silently gliding beneath a turbulent ocean. By late December, the novelty of the cold had worn off, replaced by a grim, exhausting struggle for the rest of the settlement. The deepening had begun. This was the time of year when the sun became a pale, heatless disk that mocked the earth, hanging low in the southern sky for only a few hours a day. The snow didn't melt. It accumulated, drifting into concrete hard waves that buried fences and trapped livestock. The thermometer outside Lynn's hatch read 35 degrees below zero. It was a cold that could snap a steel axe head if struck wrong. It was a cold that turned breath into ice crystals instantly, freezing eyelashes together. Jeb and Thomas were no longer laughing. Their situation was becoming desperate. The uninsulated walls of Jeb's cabin were bleeding heat faster than his stove could generate it. Frost had formed on the inside walls of his home, a glittering white fur that grew thicker every night. His wood pile, stacked proudly outside, was now a solid block of ice and snow. Every log he pried free was sodden, hissing violently when thrown into the stove, filling the room with acrid, lukewarm smoke instead of heat. He was burning 3 times the wood Lynn was, and he was still freezing. Lynn, conversely, moved through her days with a rhythmic calm. She checked the ventilation shaft, clearing the rime ice from the opening to ensure fresh air exchange. She rotated her wood stocks, moving the driest logs to the front. The air inside the dugout was dry and smelled faintly of toasted earth and willow. She could hear the footsteps of the wolves walking over her roof at night. The crunch of their paws transmitted through the soil. But they were a world away. The separation between the environment and the survivor had become absolute. But as the barometer began to drop further, signaling a pressure system so low it made the ears pop, Lynn knew the true test was approaching. The sky turned a sickly, bruised yellow, the color of old parchment. The air grew heavy and still, the calm before a violence that would rewrite the landscape. She lit a second lantern and checked the hatch bolts. The world above was about to end. The blizzard that struck the Dakota Territory that night was not merely a weather event. It was an atmospheric judge, rendering a verdict on every decision made by the settlers over the previous 6 months. The wind speed exceeded 60 miles per hour, driving ice crystals horizontal with the force of buckshot. Inside Thomas and cabin, the reality of their situation disintegrated alongside their architectural confidence. The single-pane glass window had long since frosted over, but now it bowed inward, groaning under the pressure. The seasoned timber they had bragged about began to shrink and shudder. Every knot in the pine became a leak. Every gap in the chinking became a nozzle spraying sub-zero air into the room. They had fed the stove their last dry logs hours ago. Now they were burning green wood chipped from the frozen pile outside, wood that was more ice than cellulose. It didn't burn, it smoldered, filling the frantic, freezing room with choking black smoke that stung the eyes but offered no warmth. The temperature inside their cabin dropped to 10 degrees. Water in the bucket by the door had frozen solid. They were dying, and they were dying loudly, shouting over the roar of the wind, piling blankets and coats onto shivering bodies that could no longer generate heat. 300 yards away, beneath the screaming prairie, the world was silent. Lynn sat on her earthen platform, sewing a tear in her canvas coat by the light of a tallow candle that did not flicker. The contrast was absolute. Her dugout was not fighting the storm, it was ignoring it. The 4 feet of dense soil overhead dampened the wind's fury to a rhythmic, distant thrumming, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The thermometer hanging on the clay wall read 58 degrees. It wasn't tropical, but it was life. She reached into her fuel recess. The wood here was not just dry, it was warm to the touch, having absorbed the ambient heat of the room for weeks. She selected a split log of oak, feeling its rough, desiccated bark. When she opened the iron door of her stove, the draft pulled inward with a hungry clarity. She tossed the log in. It caught fire in seconds, cracking sharply, the sound of pure, efficient combustion. There was no smoke in the room, only the smell of baking earth and hot iron. She poured herself a cup of tea, the steam rising in a perfect vertical column. Above her, the world was ending. Below, she was simply waiting. By dawn, the wind had shifted, piling snow in drifts 12 feet high. The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying. Jeb, his face waxy and gray with the onset of hypothermia, could no longer feel his feet. The stove in their cabin was dead, a cold iron tomb in the center of a room that was now indistinguishable from the outside world. Thomas, wrapped in 3 rugs and shaking violently, looked at his partner with wide, terrified eyes. They had to move, or they would be statues by noon. They remembered the woman. They remembered the hole. With the desperation of drowning men, they kicked open their snow-blocked door, tumbling out into the blinding whiteness. The journey was less than a quarter mile, but in the deep snow it was a mountaineering expedition. They crawled more than they walked, gasping in the thin, frigid air, their eyes searching the flat expanse for the chimney smoke that would signal life. They didn't see a house. They saw a mound, a hummock in the snow, breathing a thin, steady ribbon of gray vapor into the blue sky. It looked like the breathing hole of a seal in the ice. They fell against the heavy, slanted hatch of the dugout, hammering on the wood with frozen fists. "Help!" Jeb croaked, his voice a broken whisper. "For God's sake!" The hatch didn't rattle. It held firm, solid as a bank vault. Then the internal bolts slid back with a heavy metallic clack. The hatch lifted. The air that rushed out hit them like a physical blow. It was moist, warm, and smelled of life. Lynn stood on the steps looking up at them. She wore no coat, only a heavy wool sweater. She did not look surprised. She did not look vindicated. She simply looked at them with that same terrifyingly calm assessment she had used when digging the pit. She saw the frostbite on their noses, the clumsy, wooden way their hands moved. She stepped back, clearing the way. "Boots off at the bottom," she said. It was not a request. It was the command of the captain, allowing survivors onto her lifeboat. The descent into the dugout was a journey across latitudes. With every step down the earthen stairs, the season changed. Winter remained at the top. Autumn lingered in the middle. And at the bottom, on the hard-packed clay floor, it was a distinct, dry spring. Thomas and Jeb collapsed onto the bench Lynn had carved from the earth, their bodies convulsing as the blood began to painfully return to their extremities. They looked around, wide-eyed. This was no damp grave. The walls were whitewashed with a mixture of lime and clay, reflecting the lantern light to create a soft golden glow. The floor was swept clean. But their eyes were drawn inevitably to the north wall, the recess. It was stacked floor to ceiling with wood, dry wood. Wood that looked like it had been sitting in a carpenter shop for a year. Jeb began to weep, a sound of sheer exhaustion and relief. It's dry," he stammered. staring at the fuel as if it were gold bullion. How? The snow. The rot. Lynn poured boiling water into 2 tin cups, dropping in dried mint leaves. She handed them to the men. The earth breathes, she said, sitting opposite them on a low stool. She picked up a piece of firewood, holding it up for them to see. You fight the cold. You build walls to keep it out. But walls have cracks. I use the earth's heat. The ground is 50 degrees. I only have to heat the last 10. She pointed to the flue running along the floor. The smoke gives its heat to the floor before it leaves. You send your heat to the sky. I keep it here. She tossed the wood into the stove. It flared instantly. This wood has been drying in this warmth since October. Your wood is outside drinking the snow. Wet wood boils water. Dry wood warms blood. It was a lecture on thermodynamics delivered in the tone of a nursery rhyme, simple, undeniable, and devastating to the men's ego. They sat in the warmth of the hole they had mocked, drinking tea made by the woman they had pitied, and realized that their civilization was a fragile veneer, while her grave was a fortress of physics. This is a pause in our history, a moment where we must break the glass of the narrative to look at what is actually happening here. We often view the pioneers of the past as rough-hewn gamblers surviving on grit and gunpowder. But look at the specific engineering Lynn employed. This wasn't luck. This is the lost art of passive geothermal regulation, a science that predates the Roman hypocaust and the modern, quote, earthship. We, in our modern comfort, have forgotten the brutal arithmetic of the wild, that insulation is survival, and thermal mass is a battery that never runs out of charge. If you value this kind of recovered wisdom, the intersection of history and hard survival science, consider subscribing to this archive. We are digging up the blueprints that kept humanity alive long before the grid existed. Now, back to the thaw. The winter of 1874 did not let up, but the dynamic of the settlement had permanently shifted. When the spring thaw finally arrived, turning the prairie into a vast, muddy mirror, the landscape of the community changed. The surviving frame cabins, warped and leaking, were dismantled. Men who had once scoffed at the dirt now stood knee-deep in it, swinging picks with a newfound respect. They came to Lynn not with ridicule, but with charcoal pencils and scraps of paper, asking for dimensions. They measured the depth of her floor. They measured the angle of her flue. They touched the dry wood in a recess like pilgrims touching a relic. The soddy became the standard of the plains, but the specific innovations Lynn introduced, the internal fuel storage, the subfloor ventilation, the thermal banking, were the difference between merely surviving and actually living. Lynn never gloated. She helped them measure. She showed them how to mix the clay with buffalo grass to prevent the walls from slumping. She taught them that the earth was not something to be conquered, but a blanket to be pulled tight. Years later, when the railroad brought brick and coal, and the dugouts were replaced by Victorian farmhouses, the old-timers still kept their root cellars deep and wide, a cultural memory of the winter when the ground saved them. Lynn lived on that plot for 40 years. She never built a house above ground. She added a window, a skylight of thick glass that looked up at the stars, but she stayed in the earth. When she passed, they found her journals. They weren't filled with poetry or prayers. They were filled with temperature logs, wind speed calculations, and drawings of airflow, the testament of a mind that found salvation in competence. We live in an age of fragile systems. We build high. We build glass. We rely on a flow of energy that is constant and invisible, until it isn't. Lynn's story is not just a historical curiosity. It is a mirror. When the power fails, when the storm comes that is bigger than our infrastructure, we are all just Jeb and Thomas, freezing in our uninsulated boxes. The earth is still there, waiting, holding its steady 50 degrees. The physics haven't changed. Only our attention span has. Competence is not about having the newest tool. It is about understanding the environment so deeply that the environment becomes your tool. The next time the wind howls and the lights flicker, ask yourself, are you building up, exposing yourself to the storm, or are you digging down where the fire stays dry?